Hello, good evening. Hi Sandeep. Hi Mahesh. Nice to see you guys. Let's wait for a few minutes for people to join. Abhay Chandra, hi. People who join early will have kind of a privilege to kind of greet and meet. And once we get started, we may not be able to say hi to everyone. So, Mahesh, I will wait for your go ahead to get started. We'll wait. Okay. Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining on this Saturday night for this session. Uh, there have been few questions on test design and which have been submitted before this live session. Let me get started with few of them. Uh, the overall title of the topic is about looking at the evolution of how this whole process of test design started and how in the past people testers did the test design and how in the today's world, agile DevOps fast-paced world, how testers should adopt and change their style of test design is the topic, and we will be accommodating the questions as and where as they come in. uh, See, uh, previously when we looked at maybe early 80s or 90s, we had what is called as test procedure. This idea of test procedure kind of dates back to the times where we had hardware devices and there is a prescribed process or a procedure which is written down in detail, and people who are testing or people who are accepting it used to use that process to go through the so-called test procedure to check the efficiency or the correctness or help to take a decision whether that particular subject or the particular object or whatever the test subject could be selected, or it should be accepted as pass or fail. From there, when we started doing the software test design, the earlier test designs were more driven from what specifications were written, and on the basis of what you can write the details. Uh, in the earlier days, there were no specific test and tester and developer kind of segregation. So you would have a lot of developers writing test cases. In my own experience in early 90s, when I was coding as well as doing test design, my test design was more on the basis of what code I have written. So it is more kind of a reflection of, okay, these are the lines of code, or this is the logic that I have written. Let me write few tests, maybe not much of writing per se, but let me, when I'm executing, when I'm testing my piece of code, I would, uh, my test design would be driven mostly by the code knowledge that I have. Then when the independent testing role started evolving, which is in the early 2000s, and when this new member of the team called tester is given the requirements, given the software, given the some knowledge of the code, the idea of things coming into a picture, these things these things got into the practice started. In that practice, what happened is people started writing the detailed procedures. Now, in order to look at what happens or what should happen in the actual test design process, and many of the questions are related to the timelines and how do we convince our management, what tools we can use. For answering all those questions, let me give you in my opinion, what happens or what should happen when we say so-called test design. Uh, uh, okay, Mahesh wants me to kind of take a little slight detour and give me some introduction or some kind of update on my journey as a tester. I have started off into the software world per se somewhere around 97, 98. I started off as a software developer for few years. I did coding in the supply chain and demand chain management domain. The coding were mostly in the C++ and not much of a Java per se, but C, C++. Building this code on Unix and various flavors of Unix and Windows. And around 2000, I think the role getting segregated into testing. And some of the feedbacks that I received from my bosses, my peers, they recognized an aspect, or they recognized one ability in me where I used to find issues, I used to find inconsistencies. And believe me, in those days there is no segregation between dev and test. So we used to code, we used to test. In that, my managers have given a very clear feedback to me saying that you seem to be having a very good eye on doing testing. Why don't you take that uh, uh, as a profession? And that's the time when it is kind of segregated as a testing role. It's called as a QA. Then it is still to be people confuse between testing and QA, but around 2000 roughly, I can say, I launched myself into full time into testing. Working for a few companies, it was like one was my 4 to 5 years of early software development in I2 technologies, where I learned the entire uh, SDLC per se. So that helped me quite a lot. Where when I became a tester, I was not hesitant to ask or hesitant to know how developers build their code, how they deploy the code. A lot of things that are dev friendly. I came from that world, so it helped me initially for a few years to kind of establish myself in testing. Then 2004 to 2005, did a lot of hands-on testing as a test lead and managing a small team of testers. That went into a kind of establishing myself into learning testing, and in between few of the you know uh, uh, I took the roles into more into test consulting, where I work with a group of testers, helping them to understand how do they manage their testing processes. That kind of took the focus from doing into little higher level, where I can look at test processes across the groups and how each organizations look at testing, and help them with establishing the work, establishing the process, establishing how the test and dev coordinate. That's about 4 to 5 years of test consulting. And between 2010 to 2016 at Barclays, I had a very technical role. It is kind of focused more on automation and performance testing. A lot of mobile automation came into picture. That's where the agile DevOps kind of went big time into there. And in my current role, I'm kind of back from so-called manual testing to so-called automation to testing, where there is not much of an automation. So that's the about 15 to 18 years of journey for me. Uh, Getting back to where I left the thread, the test design as an activity, which is probably the initial part of how testers should start thinking about how to conduct testing, what to do, is kind of started with the should start with the test design. In my mind, the bulk of the work that goes into so-called test design is about thinking and modeling. Most of the traditional approaches in test design directly jump into techniques, black box, white box. The right opinion, in my way, is to take the requirement. I mean, I wouldn't call piece of requirement or one requirement or two requirement. You will be given either requirement document or a module or a feature to test. The first thing is to draw a mental model of how the requirement, how that feature, how the system is being represented. So you need to draw a model. So that's where the bulk of the work goes in representing the feature or the portion of the application as a module, as a model. When you do a model, that will tell you that okay, that model will guide you thereafter. If some inputs are given, the model will help you to understand what will happen in the output. This is one input output kind of a model. If you get the modeling right, from there you can go into the aspects of applying techniques. You could use black box, you could use white box, you could use the requirements per se, or you could use the knowledge of the code. So the black box, white box, and the so-called entire body of knowledge in the test design depends upon the model of the application that you're going to start with. Most of the test design books and techniques don't really explicitly tell you to model this feature. Model module or the group of requirements together. If you get the model right, then you could go ahead and ask which technique I'm going to apply, how I'm going to apply techniques. So the next thing is, once you have model done in one way. So let's say you are going to use the techniques black box. Let's start with black box techniques. So you have this boundary value, equivalence class, state-based machine, decision trees, and pair value, combinatorics. Few of the techniques that are very popular in the black box start from the model. For example, if you are applying the, I will just give boundary value, equivalence, and decision tree as an example, so that we can take few more questions. Boundary value technique, if you were to apply, you can't apply boundary value to a very high level of the requirement or the module or the feature. The boundary value analysis per se applies to one specific attribute or a parameter of the feature that you're trying to test. Now, depending upon what that parameter is, what type of parameter is, input, output, an integer or a string, what type of data it is, the boundary value model needs you to say, let's say that you are talking about a number. That number, what model you should think about in this case, you have a model in which think of the feature as a kind of a big strip where there is a lower limit and there is an upper limit. So this cannot be applied to a higher level feature. It applies to a parameter. If you have multiple parameters in a feature, you need to think about, I have 4 or 5 parameters of this type. I will have to apply boundary values. I have to think about each parameter having boundaries. Now that boundary, you should, again, if you get deeper into it, that boundary may be imposed by UI. For example, in a particular text box, you can't enter more than 6 characters, but that is not the boundary really. You need to get deeper into how the UI is processing, how it is passing on to. So there are multiple boundaries that you need to pass through. Here is where thinking about model explicitly for boundary value looks into black box view. Then you might look into where that value being passed to. There is the boundary there, and that value being processed by a kind of a servlet or a service that passes at that level. There is a boundary there. That value is passed to say database for either inserting or a search or a query. We have multiple boundaries as you go. So sky is the limit. If you want to really want to do boundary value analysis of one parameter starting from UI until the entire journey tracing back to where it is persisted and again back to the UI, you can look at boundary value itself in a very detailed way. Now, if you move on to equivalence class partitioning, you need to look at the same parameter having accepting the huge group of values. Now you are coming away from the boundary, you are coming into the middle part where it is neither this boundary nor that boundary. Equivalence class partitioning will help you to think about using a small set of values. Those values will be treated by the application in a similar way. That is a principle, which means that if I if I identify in the middle part of the domain of the data for the parameter, if that domain is taking about 10,000, 15,000 values, we need to create, that's design again, we need to create those groups of equivalence classes. And the assumption there is each one, if you take one class, all the values in that class, let's say the one class is about 300 values, just an example, all the 300 values in that class will be processed by the application in a similar way. That's the principle. Now you can scrutinize that once you make your equivalence classes, and then check whether your equivalence classes are correct or not. So that is the second part of the black box way. Here also you can look at how the equivalence classes, when you look at the application processing, whether it is at the UI, whether it's a service, the database, you can go all the way from what inside of the application that you can get into and start applying the equivalence class principle there. Then another most popular black box test technique is the state-based model. This is called finite state-based model. Now we have a class of testing called model-based testing, which is nothing but treating the entire application as a state-based model. What is a simple in sense a state-based model is one good example would be telephone. So telephone has a different states in terms of it is available for call, it is engaged, and it is switched off, like that. Each of the states of the system is represented as a graph. So it is if you look at mathematics behind it, the technique involves identifying the unique states of the application and moving from when we exercise the test, we essentially moving from one state to another state like a travel. So it is represented as a graph, nodes and paths. So there are techniques which are like your fastest, shortest path between two states, and longest path, and the most widely used path, and there are variations of the techniques that are applied to finite state machine model. So in each of these, you need to zoom in or zoom out your view of the application. And I'm talking about black box. You're not getting into the code. You could get into the code and apply certain techniques in the way, asking where is the boundary, what equivalence classes are there, is the feature something like a decision tree, if loop, consider if loop, or there are can I represent the application as a state machine or not. So these are the examples of creating a model. Now for all of those who said test design is boring or test design is like repetitive and monotonous, there is a lot to it. When you start applying these things and creating models, then you will come to know the intricate challenge that it poses to you, and creating the models and representing the models and then thinking through what a test case would be through this is really a very interesting and challenge. Then the next part, after you have created a model, you have understood how the system works, you have applied, you have enriched the model, put all the requirements have been incorporated into the model, you have discussed with the model with your peers and the developers. Then the next thing is to, though I would little hesitate to use the word generate, it is more like, let me start bringing my test cases out of the model. Mostly writing test cases, when people say prepare test cases, write test cases, all they are saying is you have worked out your model. You know what paths to cover in the model. But that whole assumption of the model being there is very implicit. Nobody knows. Hardly people understand there is a model there, and you are trying to get your head around the model and generate the test cases. There were some questions on the page asking about which tools we should use, where we can gain the efficiency by writing test cases. Look, you can you can gain from the tools when you have created the model correctly. Most of the time, if you are, let's say you have a feature which is having some 7 8 parameters, and you want to figure out how we can build a set of values that exercise the model uh, thoroughly. In that case, you can use the tools to generate the combinations. uh, you know there are the pairwise combination tools available, and there is Perlclip, which is created by James Bach, which will help you to create a lot of values on the fly. Tools will be helpful to you in the test design to create combinations and the values of matrix of the variations that you would like to use. That's where you can gain from the tools to do. But the bulk of the work is supposed to be done by you in terms of getting the model through. Which requirement, how you are representing the model, how the model or uh, uh, the feature that you're trying to represent is depicting the requirement that you want to test. That's where the bulk of the thinking goes. So I would say 80% of the test design is thinking and modeling. Rest 20% is writing down the creating the combinations and writing down the process. Now, most of the people feel it boring because they are being asked to write down the process, the test design or the test case, which is more descriptive, more verbose. There is no lot of hardly any thinking goes there, and most of the test cases look like your expected your test steps, expected result, actual result, and some of the test cases are detailed as switch on your computer, launch your browser, navigate to the URL. You get this screen, maybe sometimes login, sometimes the home page and all that. Most of the test cases seem to be very boring to you because you see the hand holding way of walking through the your test case, and somewhere at the end you say check whether this particular error message comes, or whether this particular you get a message that the operation has been successful, or this item has been edited, or item has been deleted, and so on. The That is probably, in my opinion, not the best way to write test cases. That the whole test design and the test cases documentation and representation has to be optimized for helping you to test and find the bugs which you want to hunt in the application as efficiently as possible. That is tester's objective. Now, at broad level, how elaborate your test case should be is something which is decided by what is called as information objective. Who are you writing this test case for? Is this test case supposed to be written for as a systematic representation of the what feature is, and it will be used by many people down the line? It has to be detailed enough so that the person who doesn't understand the application should be able to read the test case and understand and execute the testing. Then you would write it in a specific way. Whereas if the approach is to apply the intelligence or the insight that you have gained by proper modeling, your simplified or a optimized representation will help you to find the bugs, in which case your some mind map would do. Many times you would have a test case which is nothing but an Excel table having the values and the combinations to try out. That's a test case for you. There is a maybe test suite for you, but that will not be useful to be given to somebody who comes after 1 year, 2 year down the line. You don't know who that person is, what his level of understanding of the application. If you want to write for that person, you write it differently. Many of the processes would look at writing this in detail. In the process, you lose the objective of doing test design. That's why the whole the process of test design and the writing the test cases, scenarios, and documenting them and putting them into Excel sheet, copy paste, copy paste, copy paste, it becomes very monotonous, and it becomes it becomes difficult to maintain as well. Like as you do the test case for one release, and after two release the requirement changes, you will really have to struggle hard to find out which test cases I need to update, where I should go and update. And in the today's fast-paced world, you will not get enough time to go and say, let me go and update my test cases. That doesn't work. Okay, let me pause for a while and look at few test cases, a few of the comments that have come in, so that I can answer this. Okay, I think many of the questions are related to what I mean by model. Okay, model in a clear definition, or the definition that I can use it for this particular session, is representation of some reality. It could be a diagram, it could be a sketch, it could be a table of values, it could be something that you write it in words that you can think of. Mind map is a model of an application. It is just a sketch of how you think the system would work. Now I gave example of the boundary value, where you are going to take a parameter, write it down as a strip, a long rectangle, and mark the boundaries and say, here are the boundaries for this particular value. There is a model for you. This model is applied at a very granular level. Boundary value applies to a parameter. Now, if you are going little above in terms of multiple parameters together, and you look at the application as state machine, then you would think about writing it down like a graph or maybe a flow chart, where you say, okay, when I log in, the application is here. When somebody adds an item, the state of the application changes, and then you kind of put the application will be in a different state. It responds to the requests differently. So you need to go, I mean, I think test modeling or the rating model will be a detailed session in itself. And this particular session will not allow me to kind of elaborate and give examples and show. Probably I will post some of the some examples, worked out examples in my blog later, if time permits. Okay, there is a question that, are there any tools to design the test case apart from MS Excel to minimize the time? Look, as I repeat, tools will help you if you have a model with you. Tools will help you. Let's say that I take a parameter. This parameter is of integer type. It takes the value from here to here, and I need to generate what values I want to test. That there the tools can help. If I have 5 parameters, I have worked out all the possible values that I want to. I mean, I can write down some of the values that I want to generate. The tools will help. Among the 5 or 6 parameters that I'm testing for a feature, I want to use the best pair combination. That is, there is a technique called Pairwise Combinatoric, which will help you if you give all the values in a table. It will help you. Each pair is a test case, and making sure that we don't repeat the pairs. And using that technique, you'll be in a position to generate from a larger group of values. You'll be able to generate an optimized set, which as per the principle will have a highest chance of finding a bug for you. So tools will help you to generate the values. But what a test case after all? Test case after all is a summarized view of the intent of what test you want to run. Much of the stuff or the essence of test case is in how you are exercising that requirement, what interesting combinations of values you are trying out, what values you are observing, you need to observe, and that in my opinion, much of it is the job of thinking, modeling, rather than putting it together. So think of tools for creating. Mahesh, can you see me? Is this okay? Okay. I think many questions were earlier on the model. Probably we need to have a separate session on modeling itself, where we can take examples of some features and um, uh, take that and continue for the test modeling of the features for test design as a separate session. So as a as a summary, whole test design process starts with understanding requirements and looking at how the system is constructed, creating a model of the application. That model will help you to exercise, apply various techniques there, and understand and generate the combinations. That combinations then will become the guiding tool for you to document and write more test cases. Pause now. As Yes, yes, I will cover the agile and DevOps design process in a minute. Okay, so the one of the very recurring question is that in waterfall you used to have waterfall models there where the projects have a distinct test phase. Either tester is brought early in the life cycle or in the late in the life cycle. There was, as the test managers and test leads and the dev leads, there is a specific time allocated to do the test. They call it test scripting, right? Test scripting or test design. There's a time given, so you could take your time to document, write them, load them into your test management tools, and sometimes there is a review process where you get reviewed by BAs, get reviewed by developers, and you could go all that luxury to write them. But in the agile and the post agile or DevOps model, where the whole cycles are shrinked, you work on a very specific short cycle, overall from requirement to delivery. The key question is, how do we do the test design? Now, my opinion is overall principles of test design by and large remain same. They don't change if you're doing waterfall model or you go for agile. Given the fact that you have a short time cycle, your job is to optimize the test model, and without instead of going into a very detailed step-by-step writing test cases, my suggestion is that you need to choose specific techniques that you want to put, and keep the models and the test cases in a very lightweight format. As most of the agile requirements these days come in the form of test stories, which are loaded into the tools like Jira's, where the Jira story, if you will, is a very condensed form of requirement. Now, you could create multiple models for one requirement, or maybe multiple requirements, multiple Jira stories can share one particular model together, and that model can be represented in some kind of a sketch or kind of an Excel table, which you can upload as a base. From there, you can write your test cases. Your test cases, writing test cases mean for a particular feature, what is my minimal representation of the test case that I can use as a starting point. When I come to test execution or exercising the application with the inputs and outputs and observing and what actual testing happens, I may use that minimal model or representation to guide my testing process. So the in view of the shrink time frame, the focus goes on thinking rather than writing it down. So many people have suggested, what about mind maps? Can we use mind maps? Mind maps are the great ways to represent your thinking. It is a great way to create a model. But mind map has a specific model. Mind map itself is a as a model where all the ideas have to emerge from a central theme. In some cases, you may not be able to represent your thought process in the mind map very well. In that case, you could use a free form sketches. You could actually do a sketching on the white paper or hand sketches and then take it from there and upload it as an image or something like that. What is important is get your model through and represent it in a minimalistic format that you can put it, and then you could use keywords, or you could use uh, your own format of writing down the what needs to be tested. You could add some table of values for supporting this, in which case you can create a very thin or a light version of so-called test case, which you can upload it to specific Jira, which the requirement which you are trying to test. So for agile short cycle processes where tester is supposed to complete this whole process, the recommended approach is use the thin or the lighter version of your representing the model and the steps that you want to do, more like a reminder to you what you want to do, rather than the entire test case written down by step guiding your entire thinking. In fact, you get stuck with the thinking if you go by following the step by step procedure. That's my recommendation for agile. DevOps in strict sense is not a separate SDLC model in itself. Most of the time people use the words agile and DevOps as though they are completely two different models or the two different ways of doing stuff. For DevOps to succeed, your whole engineering team has to be on agile first. That's a kind of a prerequisite. What do you mean by DevOps in my opinion, a quick sense is that most of the time in agile, the focus ends the moment the application is ready to be released to the production. Most of the cycles end there. But in DevOps, it includes the process right from the point it is build is signed off until it is until it goes live, deployed, configured, tested, and maybe a quick some part of the operations process that go through some of the due diligence, some of the preparing the environment, things like that. This broadly put under operations. Bringing the operations people into the party, bringing them into the overall cycle of the SDLC is what DevOps is trying to do. So DevOps is nothing but an extended agile model where you have the operations people into this. So there is no specific process for test design for DevOps. What you try to do in agile, same thing applies to DevOps as well. That's my answer to this. Okay, the question is there any software that writes test cases by itself? That's an interesting question. It's like asking, is there any software that does thinking on its own? Each software needs some feed in terms of what parameters you want to feed, what logic is there. Unless that such kind of inputs are given and there is a logic that takes these parameters and binds them in some logic and produces the output. If you are looking for a software that generates test cases, you are essentially saying that this software, if I enter the values or enter the requirement, it will parse the requirement in English, it will make its own understanding, and it will apply the techniques. I'm not aware of any such tool that does such an elaborate and sophisticated thinking, which is possible by a skilled, experienced, curious tester. I don't think any software can do that. Tools can help you, but you don't understand where you apply the tool to guide your thinking. Human tester, the curious and questioning tester at the center of the whole process, trying to use a tool based on what task he wants to do. So use the software or use a tool as a help to guide your thinking rather than looking for a tool to do the thinking for yourself. I, at least in my opinion, I don't know is there any tool that does the thinking on your own. Looking at a few more test cases, few more questions here. Okay, until the next question comes, let me take a question on, there was this query on what percentage of the test cases should be negative or positive, what is the recommended thing. Look, the whole idea of negative and positive is merely the function of a logic. There is no such percentage that your test cases should be negative or positive. Now, if the requirement is stated in such a way that it accomplishes all of the software applications we use accomplish certain tasks, either save data or help us to edit data or do some useful activity through software. Now, a positive test case is one which will demonstrate in how many different ways you can accomplish the task successfully. That is a definition of a positive test case. Whereas the negative test case is, which is the everything else of the world. So if you put a universe of test cases, one portion of the test cases are actually exercising the software in a direction where a task is accomplished. How many different ways you can accomplish a task. Now, what is left over is in how many ways you can mess up with the system, not ending up in accomplishing a task, and you expect that the software doesn't do anything silly, doesn't do anything which is wrong, or doesn't do anything which is harmful for the person who is using the software, or data privacy, or you can name it. All of that comes in the whole world of negative. There is no such suggestion where you can do how many test cases are positive and how many test cases negative. Developers seem to be saying that if you find out an interesting case under this combinations of these negative values, software crashes. Right? That is the negative outcome of a test that you're trying to do. If that negative outcome, if the developer says, most of the time this is highly unlikely that any user in his full senses would try to exercise like this. Most of the developers will push off the negative test case like that. But as we have seen, most of the cases, the hackers and the people who are trying to exploit the vulnerability in the software would always look for, how do I get the software into a stage where it is not meant to come to, and exploit the system which is on which it is installed and the network and entire infrastructure using that. Most of the time when we hit upon a negative test case, one way to convince the developers to think about the impact and the risk of that is to give a case of a hacker, or give a case of how one could compromise the system, compromise the entire infrastructure using the particular application as a gateway. So many times when using the negative cases, you crash the system and it throws up a certain valuable parameters or valuable outcomes or information about the software, its version, its database, or the app server details and infrastructure details in such a way that an attacker could exploit. So negative test cases are useful in this way, that negative test cases should not make the software to explore or to expose the information about the software or infrastructure. So a negative test case, its role is to make sure that when I exercise the software in that way, it doesn't throw up something which is unexpected, which can be exploited. So that is the definition of negative. But more positive, negative, all combinations kind of a thing will come only when you have a short time. You have to choose the right ones, few positive, few negative, and look at what how much of the code or a requirement the test cases exercise. Using that, you can arrive at a specific combination. That there is no such guidance. It all depends upon your context, your application, your feature that you're testing. Tools. Okay. Many times, another question that has come up, which is in with respect, relevant with respect to agile DevOps as well, is that how can we showcase the value of test design process to our senior management? This is most important, and this doesn't apply to test design alone. It applies to testing in general. Now we are at a stage where many senior stakeholders, senior executives are asking what is the value that testing is bringing to the people. Most of the standard approach is to showcase that if the testing is not doing its job correctly, certain number of important defects will be, or the critical defects will be leaked to production that will result in the outage of the software that impacts the customers. There is loss of customer base, loss of revenue, blah, blah, blah. Now, at least I'm seeing the shift in the trend, at least especially post 2010 or 2015, the appetite for taking the bugs which are in the production has increased a bit. People now say, okay, it is important to go live now with these features. If there are bugs, so be it. We'll go live and we'll fix them as they come along, because either the going live with the feature is critical because of the regulatory requirements, because this has to be met by X and X date, or there is a competitive advantage that a particular company is going to gain by going live. Hence, the focus on whether this bug is going to be, a proper testing will ensure that the bugs are not leaked into production, is slowly losing its shine in terms of making it a very persuasive case why the companies or the engineering team should invest in good testing. What we can do as an alternative, look at what in today's world the executives and the businesses value. What they value is how the entire engineering team, now see how the terminology is changed. Instead of talking dev team or test team or a BA team or a operations team, we are talking of one engineering team. You are part of that engineering team. So when you're working as one team, the role of testing and the role of test design included becomes how you can serve to the team goal of releasing the features in live with the quality that is feasible, that they can potentially meet, good enough quality. So as a tester, don't get stuck with this whole thing that I can't let this defect go live, and I keep my foot down and I will make a lot of noise about this is going to be this risk, that risk, and so on. Instead of that, align your skills, align your mentality. How can you partner with the development teams? How can you partner with the business to make sure that the software is released as per the intended time and with the quality that executives are willing to sign off? If the executives are willing to sign off of a quality where there are X number of known bugs with certain workarounds, everybody is aware of the risk that they are taking, don't become a block in the release. Anyway, nobody is going to care, because people, if the executives decide to go live, they decide to go live regardless of what you say. In that case, in order to be relevant, in order to be helpful in the journey, you should align to the team goals and make your skills relevant in that direction. So testing should make sure how fast I can release. How can I help my developer to release the software faster? How can I partner with him during the earlier stages of development? Now, all this come to test design as well. Now, if you, in the agile DevOps, as people have asked in the questions, you don't have time, and you can't say that I need about 10 days or whatever X number of days for doing test design. You don't have time. You need to kind of optimize your skills as how quickly you can create a model, how quickly you can represent your test cases in a minimal format that you can use and carry forward. How can that minimal test design can guide you to do the testing so that you can revert back to the development team about the feature that you're testing? In this way, you are being helpful, not hell-bent on saying that I need to do this tick in the box, which is I need to write this test case, I need to document, I need to upload, I need to get sign off from the teams, BAs or development. Those formalities are dissolving in the new world of agile DevOps, where engineering teams are working hard to make sure that the things are gone live. That doesn't mean the test design as a process, test design as an activity goes away, but it takes a new shape. It takes a shape where how quickly we can model things. So that's why I'm coming back again and again to that idea of model. How can you represent what you're testing? How can I use my techniques to see which which model of among the techniques, either the black box or white box, I can apply to this particular requirement. If you start working on those for 2-3 requirements, you will get used to this whole paradigm of modeling and trying to get test cases out of it in a minimal time, and so that you can use them as a guide to execute. A lot of ideas in the exploratory testing uh, goes from the fact that you are thinking on the feet. You are thinking as you are executing. When you are doing that kind of a testing, you can, most of the time, people who are doing good exploratory testing have the model in the mind. They are thinking that, okay, if I do this, if I exercise this, if I pause here, if I click this button, if I go from here to there, they are actually drawing the model in their mind. Now, formalizing that model into some kind of a sketch, or some kind of a diagram, some kind of a table of values, some kind of a mind map is only helping you to guide in the process of finding bugs now, finding issues now, trying to find the problems now. So the test case design as an activity remains very much there, and is important to be effective in doing testing, but it is to be squeezed in thinking, doing. Most of the time when you're doing exploratory testing, you are actually thinking and doing, and your next step, your next action is dependent on what you have discovered in the previous thing, and that means you are doing modeling on the fly, dynamic modeling. But again, what helps is you should always start with some rudimentary model in the thing, and bring back those elements of the model as we proceed. So again, how do you showcase the value of the test design to the senior management? The better question is, how do I showcase the value of testing? Because in the squeezed time frame, you will not have the individual blocks for test design, test execution, test reporting. You will not have these blocks. So easy way, other way is to look at outcome of the testing in given time frame. What kind of information you can provide about the state of the quality of the application? What kind of unknown things that you can bring about which developer didn't know, or what kind of anomalies you can bring about what is being coded? Those are the outcomes that you need to showcase, saying that because of this testing session, or because of this whole thing I have gone through, which has test design included in it, try to get the value of that in not finding so many bugs in the given time, not in the form of see, these bugs I have found out, if I did not discover this and reported and not fixed, they would have resulted in the production. So as I said, the focus on quality has changed from less bugs to, is it fast enough? Can I release it now? Can I go live now? Can I change? Can I go live more often? With that overridden factor, your quality criteria is not about fewer bugs. Is your quality criteria should be, is it good enough? Can I do it now? How fast and how frequently I can change? Whatever tester can add value to that through test design, through execution, sometimes test execution, test design going in parallel, how I can add value is what you need to contribute to the project. Now, there was a question on TDD, test-driven development, and how that is related to test design. Test-driven development, on the contrary to, as the word says, as many would believe, is not a testing practice at all. It is the practice of building incrementally the code. It is a development practice. The word, unfortunately or fortunately, the word test is attached to it. In the test-driven development, covered in a very simple sense, aims at writing a small portion of the code, maybe a small function or a piece of the function or some kind of a module or a unit of code. And before you write the unit of the code, it is mandatory as a part of the practice, you used to think about a test, one or more, that will exercise the logic in a very isolated unit level. Now, when as the practice goes, you would write the test first, and sometimes the TDD is called as test first development as well. It is development practice. Developers will write a test. Now, here is where for many people that who are coming from a black box world, test case is an Excel sheet with a table saying the serial number, test case ID, test description, expected values, test data, expected result, and all. This is what English, a natural language, represented artifact is what is test case for many. But for developers, a test case is probably a class, a function which they are going to execute. So the paradigm change from when you go from a black box to white box, a test is a piece of code that exercises the piece of another piece of code. So in test-driven development, you write that test, which is in the programming language, the same, mostly in the same programming language as the application is written, and with that test, first time you run against that so-called target piece of code, which is empty right now, the test will fail because there is no code written. Then you write the minimum code in the application. Now you have two things. One is your test, one is your application. Initially, the test is run with no code in the application. The test fails. Then you write minimal code to make sure that the test passes. When the test is passed again, you have completed what is called as one cycle of TDD, which means now you have a test, one or more tests, and you have a minimal code. Then that code has to be refactored. This means without changing the functionality, you have to optimize the code. So refactor is the last step in the whole cycle of TDD. So as the TDD, as the tests grow, your code and test go hand in hand. That is the promise of the TDD. So there, the thinking is pretty much reverse. Means that if I'm writing a piece of code, I need to think about what test I will write first, and that writing test first is a code in the programming language, as opposed to test, which is in our natural language, or test case in the natural language, as most of the black boxes are used to. That is the deal about test design. There was a question on can we, what kind of test design criteria or test case or technique that we use to decide whether application is ready for go live or not. My answer to that is there is no one specific test design technique which will go and say, okay, now the software is ready to be released. There is no one such technique in that. And as we have seen, the go live criteria is more and more in today's world becoming driven by the business considerations, financial considerations, than the considerations which are purely engineering point of view, purely code or a quality point of view. That's number one. And even if you consider the situation where the go live criteria is driven or written in terms of number of high severity bugs or certain level of code coverage, or any other criteria that is directly has a bearing on the requirements, the testing output, and the inputs from how the code is constructed. Even in that case, test design technique will not be able to help you to decide whether the code is ready or not. Most of the engineering based go live criteria in my opinion, most of them have parameters like quality related parameters or code coverage related parameters. Many of the code centric parameters look at what percentage of the code is covered, what percentage of the pass rate of the tests that you have run in the unit testing level, what percentage of the regression tests pass, how many uh, defects which are as per your own definition of severity one where there are no work hours. These are the criteria that are applied to the go live. Now, you tell me, where is the role of test design? You have come to that criteria, and it is more like go live criteria is post testing, whereas test design is while testing, before testing. So I don't see a connection between go live and the test design. I am reading a question from Mahesh. Will you have a different answer to the startups founders explaining the value of testing, or the same and just explain? Why I'm asking is senior stakeholders still have seen testing in company, and you can easily give examples of case studies. How about open conversation where common data is open? Okay, so startups are probably examples of an accelerated development. Most of the non-startup companies, all the businesses who are established, where if you look at how they are releasing the software, is not much different from how the startup release. Startups are going even more ruthless in terms of value for money. If the startup were to survive, it has to kind of generate the kind of revenue that its venture capitalists or its promoters have been expecting. So the criteria for testing, the selling the value of testing to the people in the startup is even more stringent than in the non-startup cases. There, they would not actually look at you as a tester or developer or a specific role that our traditional industries give. There, everybody is part of the venture, part of the project where they are helping the business to deliver the value to the customers, thereby generating the revenues. Now, when the focus is so much drawn away from the engineering practices, you would not be able to explain to the people in the startup executives or startup promoters, tell that, okay, I need to do testing, this is how it is, and these are my practices, these are my principles, so you give me the time or you give me the thing, my freedom to do this practice as it is, as I have learned, so that you'll get these benefits. Now, when you try to get engaged with the stakeholders in that direction, what will happen is they would, all of these considerations of the engineering practices, testing practices, your principles, and what you want to do had to be very squarely aligned to the goals of the startup. How quickly we can generate the revenue, how quickly we can stop burning the cash. Those are the questions that the startups are asking. So your challenge of selling the value of testing to the startup is even more trickier than the, the case you would have with the traditional established companies. Okay, Trina is asking, exhaustive testing is impossible, exhaustive test design is also impossible. Yes, they go hand in hand. Most of the time, your exhaustive testing or your exhaustive test design is I mean, when you're testing, you are actually using the inputs that you have generated, the model and the test cases and the combinations and the path through the application, all are functions of your testing. Now, as I'm saying, in the today's world, in the engineering sense, the aim is not to get into the exhaustive testing. Aim is not to get into the exhaustive test case design. Aim is how quickly we can exercise the software given the time constraints you have, bring out the information, bring out the important data, bring out something that people don't know, and put it in a way that stakeholders can use that information to take informed decisions about how the software should be taken further. Yeah, I will look at few questions. Okay. Sandeep Garg, what is the state of test design today? What theoretical basic concept we need to bring into ECP, BVA, number, line, context do you have? Okay. The plausible examples of using the test design techniques, what we read in the book, what we actually apply. In my all experience, I have seen rarely those used as they are, as they were taught in the book. One of the reasons why this is there people don't go deeper into understanding and applying those techniques in the context of what they are testing. Most of the time, people will say, okay, I read this requirement and I need to generate X number of test cases because somebody is asking me a number or a metric. My manager wants, have you written 10 test cases today? They are looking at the volume or the number than looking at the depth of thinking or the analysis that we have done in understanding the feature. So most of the time in our world where we are chasing the some of the managers, me being one of them in many cases, are guilty of saying that we need to show this number. Okay, in that sense, the application of the technique doesn't go that big. I mean, I have not seen anybody very methodically doing this, but I have seen some good testers applying the ideas of boundary values, applying the values of equivalence classes and other things, not using them in the name per se, but incorporating the elements of the learning from them into the test design or into the testing, which goes into exploratory. Most of the time, good exploratory testers are looking for boundaries. Good exploratory testers are looking for what set of values are equivalent, or what kind of values are treated by this application similarly. Now, when they are, and what they are doing that is trying one value, two value, three value, four value, and so on. They are trying to figure out, are these handled similarly, which means that they are actually using in principle the value of the idea of equivalence class partitioning, but not putting it the way explicitly that it is ECP. But ECP is in action. People who are trying to use the time delay, trying to exercise certain combination of actions, and trying to see if certain actions can be performed with the database having certain size or certain a certain number of records. They are implicitly working on state design, state machine design. They are looking at what are the different states permitted. When the application in this state, if I perform this action, where the application will go in that state, whether that state is something which anticipated by the developer or not anticipated by the developer, which means that implicitly when they're executing, they are using the finite state machine model, which is a technique, but they may not know that they are using that. So it is important for us to go back and put those techniques into the picture, use them, incorporate them into the model, and show them that, okay, when I'm testing this, when I'm following this thread of exploratory testing, I'm using some elements of boundary, some elements of equivalence, some elements of pairwise, some elements of decision tree, some elements of state machine model. So it is there, but it is not identified as such. So it is important for us to go deeper into this and use many models and get into, probably in terms of the plausible examples, I have to kind of work it out on my own, and probably I hope to put some of the examples of this in my blog as I after this session, and I probably in the next few days I'm going to write few examples elaborating on what I meant by model. I think I use the word model. I'm guilty of not giving you I think I'm not giving you a proper example, and again having not having a board where I can draw and show something and all. I was not prepared for this kind of an interactive. need of the interactivity that is required to explain you the things, but I will probably go back and work on some things and elaborate on the model as I go along. Service based, not focusing on the importance of writing test. Okay, so Ankita, the question is, in the service companies pressurizing for the delivery, not focusing on the importance of writing test design, how being a tester you should encounter situations. As I told you, whether you are in the services company, whether in a product company, whether in a captive, aligned to the business that you are working for. Okay, many times what happens is, if you being an idealistic and purist in a sense, and say that this is what have been taught to me as a tester, regardless of which context I am in, I must insist that these principles should be followed, and I should raise my hand if the principle is not followed. And many people think that by doing it, they are actually doing the job of testing very well. In my opinion, you should have all this principle that you learn in interaction with the very other testers who are reading the books and interacting with the people and reading blogs, and all of that you learn as a theory, as the or what you learn as a practice, need not be followed in every context. It depends upon what the business need of that particular thing. So services companies, when you are part of the in a testing project, they may ask you, show me the number of test cases that you can derive in a day. I have seen many teams and the test lead asking, have you written 10 test scripts today? He or she not looking into what those 10 scripts are. They just need the number. In which case, my opinion, my recommendation would be not to hung up on whether they are giving you time to do that and all that. You have to do the justice in terms of, have I done the model correctly? Once you've done the model correctly, giving 10 test cases, 20 test cases, 30 test cases is not a matter of time. I mean, it's not a big thing. It's just you need to use the copy and paste, not cut paste, copy and paste technology to kind of create many combinations and show them, okay, here are 10 test cases or 10 scripts. Most of the time, if they see the 10 number, they're happy. So if they're pressurizing on delivery, not focusing on importance of writing test design, all they are trying to see is your testing better? You will have to, come back to what I said earlier. Focus on test modeling. Focus on using minimalistic test design to make sure that you bring the value in testing. And lastly, and most importantly, which context you are working for, which company, which kind of industry you are working for, what is the culture of that company or a group you are working for. It is always recommended to align to that while making your points clear, not by insisting that this is what it should be done, but you should show in terms of output. If you have given certain mode, one way to say that how the value of test design or the time given can be used, you should say that you could potentially show that if this time was given to me, I would have done more thinking about how to test more elaborately. Here is a some of the scenarios that I think, some of the areas that we want to cover, and have a conversation on, if the time is given, how can I apply the time to meet the goal of the team? Goal of the team is to find more bugs, align to that. If the goal of the team is to release the software in time, there is a market or a regulatory requirement that you need to meet, then insisting on test design will make you only becoming block in the whole process. As I said, the business decisions are more driven on the market facing rather than the engineering decisions, in which case you will be pushed away if you continue to insist that I should do this, give me time for doing this. They'll ask you why, how it is helping. Then you need to come back and say then the value, then the whole articulation that I said, how I'm aligning to the stakeholders' goal. So being purist is good in terms of understanding what is required to be done, but being purist doesn't help you to succeed in the job. You need to succeed in order to succeed in the job. You need to always look for aligning with the business context in which you're operating. Okay. Now there is a question on we would be identifying and maintaining 1,000 test cases or scenarios, but there are always a case 100 first scenario will be left out and identified at the later stage. How to overcome the situation? I think there is no easy answer to this. There is always, as saying, there is always one more bug to be identified. There is always one more test case to be written. This is the reality of the life. As a software developer or a tester or a coder or in any role, there is always one more to be done. Now, you can only do incremental addition in terms of how you can improve your chances that you always try to cover more from previous situation to new situation is by focusing on um, focusing on how to do proper modeling, focusing on how to be creative and imaginative in terms of understanding the requirement of the requirement from a domain perspective, from a technology perspective. Many of the testers will become good test designers if they understand and imagine through how this one piece of data, for example, one parameter that is passed from the UI until it goes deep down and sits somewhere in the database, or it is written to a file or something like that. Having knowledge of the technology architecture, layers through which the data passes through, gets modified in the process. If you are able to imagine the train of this, so train or the travel of the data could be. I mean, this is an example of a model that you're thinking about. You create a model where you, in a feature, you look at all the individual elements, input elements, output elements. Now these are explicit, okay? There are implicit. I mean, I still remember Doug Hoffman's famous sketch, How the System Can Fail, where he clearly says that there are implicit inputs, there are implicit outputs, there are explicit inputs and explicit outputs. Many things that we don't can think of is an input to the application. For example, the size, I mean, the amount of memory available which the application can use is an implicit input to the application. The state of the machine or the state of the infrastructure, state of the network, as we have seen today, the outage due to network. All of these are inputs which normal tester in a normal course of action reading to the requirement will not be able to identify as a requirement, identify as an input that is given to the application. So create a train or the travel of the data, few of the data together, make a kind of a sketch which says this data goes from here to there and through the technology layers, infrastructure layers, and finally gets written here, and the data resides there. Now, exercising that path will give you, this is a model of the application. Now, if you're able to do this effectively and be better at it, you will be in a position to showcase value to the stakeholders as well as developers. Developers will love your work in that sense because you're able to see through them, see through their work, see through their layers of the code that they have written, layers of the code that they use, meant of the third-party libraries. These days, browsers have become equally powerful. A lot of the code in the web application comes and hidden into the browser itself. Lots of browser versions and the platforms on which the browser works, the network, and the plugins that they do, and the settings of the browser itself. JavaScript enabled, JavaScript disabled, and plugins enabled, plugins disabled, the version of the browser, and so many variables that you can think of which are feeding into your test or feeding into your test execution. So if you start thinking creatively about how can you model application, it is exactly like you're given a white canvas, you're given a palette of paint. How creative you could get into, how creative you can become. There's no limit to that. You just need to be limited by, okay, I have only this much time, I have to finish this in this particular sprint or this week. That only is a limitation. But if you're getting good at creating models more again and again and again, that will make you a better modeler, better test designer, eventually a better tester. Neeraj Yadav, can you please share an experience where you went ahead of the traditional approach and worked your approach of test design and test documentation. Um, I can think of few examples where I really followed some of the things that I talked about, but the focus was very narrow. The focus was on a particular new feature that is getting implemented. The new feature is adding a particular language or a particular configuration to the existing software, which means that my scope, my requirement has been very clearly narrowed down. In that, I tried examples of, okay, say now starting asking questions saying that what parameters are there, what are input parameters, what output parameters. If I'm applying the boundary value, or if I'm applying the techniques, where do I apply? What are my parameters? What are my combinations? How do I see the system as? What are my implicit inputs? What are my implicit outputs? I went ahead and created the model, but whatever leads and managers wanted at that time was written down test cases. Here is where aligning to the business context makes more important. They wanted to see the test cases written to act more as a guide for any implementation analyst. This was a product, right? A new flow is getting implemented. How can people use those test cases as a use cases? Again, here is a term: use test case and use case. They wanted us to write test cases in such a way that they actually exercise the various facets of the feature. How to how many different ways that particular feature can be configured. What are the outcome of those uh, those configurations and combinations to the final output. Hence, at that time, the total outcome was not to execute test cases and find bugs and generally report bugs and all that. The information objective given for us was write it for the use of the implementation engineers. So we aligned our approach, written down the details, not for a tester to use, but for an implementation engineer to use. It was more like showcasing use cases and say this could be done, this could be done. If I use this combination and this combination and this combination, the outcome will be that combination. That was the requirement for writing a test case. And test case eventually became a use case, and they went into the more like a user manual. So that is an example of where traditional approach was used to create some value to the final product or the value to the project team that you're working for. I'm going backwards. Now coming forward, start up. What is your take on lean test cases where we can update the test cases based on the requirement changes? According to my understanding, test cases are ones where the segregated and the functional regression scope and can be changed ad hoc. See, you have to be very particular about, you have to be very careful about putting these labels to, oh, this is a regression test case, or this is a smoke test case, this is an ad hoc test case. These are all terms. You understand the real meaning behind them. I don't want to go into the detail that can be debate in itself, that whether the test case can be stamped as a regression test case or a functional test case. The very difference between functional regression is debatable. I don't want to get into that. But lean test case, now I was thinking this approach where the bigger problem of, if you write the test cases in detail, the one I explained now in terms of step-by-step procedures, very detailed, the challenge is it has tendency to get obsolete very soon, because software moves around, software changes in terms of its screens, and especially if it is especially if the test cases are also requiring you to attach the screenshots showing the screen layout, then they are no longer test case per se. But if your requirement is that you have to attach all those things to showcase what screenshots you have taken and all that, then it becomes even more vulnerable to immediately becoming an obsolete. So when the one flip side of writing detailed test cases, the nightmarish experience of maintaining them. Now, one thing I don't know, the modern, I mean, at least the test management systems allow for that kind of a thing. what I'm suggesting is doing some kind of a tagging. For example, a test case has a tag of, okay, this is for feature A, this is for checking the limit of certain thing, and this is covering this platform or something like that. You can add tags to the test cases. If you add tag to the test cases, you should be in a position to say, okay, now show me all the test cases that belong to this tag. Then you'll be able to get those test cases. You go and painfully go and apply and change one by one. But fortunately and unfortunately, in the today's world, nobody goes into, at least very few people will go into that elaborate way of writing test cases, because it is difficult to maintain. Some of the, again, as I said, there may be a business reason, there may be a context that demands that you have to write a detailed test procedure, test case or test procedure, in which case it becomes a requirement of the regulations or whatever the agency that you are kind of certifying the application. There, you are inevitably stuck to this problem of when the requirement moves, when the application moves from one version to another version. Tagging will help, which will help you to identify those test cases and update. But again, when your test cases are written in English like a natural language, you don't have much option to optimize that effort coming from coming from writing those test cases. Lean test cases are easy. You can, I mean, the easiest test case is your test case is documented in the form of values of a table. So each row is a test case, right? One test case 1, parameter 1, 2, 3, 4 in the columns, and each row is a test case. In which case, updating a test case is easy because you know exactly the value that are changing, right? That is an example of a lean test case. If your test case is a mind map or a sketch, the sketch can be altered because in a sketch you kind of want to add one more box or one more oval or one more circle, which will help you to introduce a new parameter that has come into the system, or something is deleted or some other flow is added. Always lean test cases are easy to update, and you could use the respective tools to update the test cases. Okay, very interesting question. In some projects, the requirements keep changing. What about test design for such projects? Now, requirement changing is order of the day. It has been there always. In those days where the projects used to run for 1 or 2 years, 3 years, there is this mandated freeze period. After that, you can't take any requirement change. Gone are the days. I mean, I find it very amusing, even today's world, testers script about requirement change. Come on, that is the life. That's how it goes. The world around us is changing faster pace than the software could change. There will be changes. So when you are in a, I mean, hardly it is difficult. Hardly I found any project where the requirements have not changed at all, which means there is a dead project. Nobody cares about that project. Where the changes are happening, that's a live project where people care about it. When initially requirements are envisaged, as tester come and say, oh, you missed this piece of the requirement, the requirement will change. Now, how do you manage test design in such projects? Same. You need to make sure that your models are updated, your understanding of the application is updated through the models. As long as you kind of keep your test design minimalistic, requirement changing means you have to go back to model and say, oh, in this model, what is changing? Which path I need to look at and is changing, because you are not written down everything in full. What you have written down, what you have represented is a model through which you have to kind of literally squeeze a test case out, or if I may use for the lack of a better word, generate test case out. You need to keep your model all the time up to date, regardless whether the requirement is changing today or tomorrow. It's like going to the sketch and say, okay, show me where is changing, which path is changing, which parameter has come in, which parameter has gone out, where the logic has changed. You should be in a position to go and point to a particular point or a spot in your model and say, this is changing. If you want to get to that stage, which means that you are doing testing correctly, and then it doesn't matter whether the requirement is changing once in a week or twice in a week. You all go back and strengthen the model. So again, going back, reiterating again and again, learn to model. That is the only sure way that you keep your test design trim, slim, effective. Okay. Another question is, what is the relation of test charters to test design in the context of exploratory testing? In exploratory testing, as many of you people already know, it is dynamic modeling and dynamic execution. There, nothing is written. There will be some background information could be there, but nothing is written down in advance that you write down as a test design, and you execute those tests in exploratory testing. Exploratory testing uses those ideas which are generated, which are appearing in response as a simulated response to what you see when you execute or when you exercise a particular test. Test charters are the one or more sentences that are guiding to that whole session. It is like summary. It's like a goal. Charter is like a goal for you. The goal would be that I want to exercise a particular feature. You can be as specific as you can, so that you can actually nail down what you want to do. In next half an hour, I'm going to work on checking whether this particular field is vulnerable to cross-site scripting or not. That's my chapter. That's my charter. Now, once I fix the charter and start my exploration, I may take few minutes to write down something. That's a model there. That model is created on the fly. As I see more of it, I will change the model as I'm testing. So in exploratory testing, you start with a blank page or some sketch that you have some background information of the feature that you're testing. At the end of your session, it would be a completed picture of the model of what you have tested. So charter is a goal, and test design not as a separate process from exercising or executing. In exploratory testing, they merge together. Test design and execution merge together into an activity where you exercise, you see something that will give you an idea to do next test, and that test design is done on the field. Map of charter to requirements, something there. Okay, accumulating. Never wrote a REST API manual test cases. Tell me whether you're designing the change remain same or approach. Okay, now this is the Ankita, the question on the REST APIs or APIs in general. Let's not complicate it by using REST API per se. APIs are the programming units that meant to be used by another program. So people need to understand what do you mean by API per se, application programming interface, which means what? A program that is meant to be used by another program. If you start using it like a human, as in APIs are not meant for final end user consumption. They are building blocks of another application. For example, all the SDK that you get, on which the developers use and create a code, are APIs. Now, even the software such as like your Facebook or Twitter, all these units, all these full-fledged applications have their APIs which other programs can use. Now, if I'm developing an app which will need a Twitter feed, I'm going to use a Twitter API, which means that program is that API, that piece of code, that interface is meant for use by another program. Now, if API is your target, my approach of modeling the API is still there. Now you're going to ask what the API is going to do. What is probably some of the techniques becomes narrowed down, because APIs in most of the cases may not have a state associated with them, so you can't model them as state machines. You may have some logic there. You may use the what you call decision tree. You can model the flow in the API as a decision tree model. you can still look at the boundary variant equivalence class partitioning, because you are going to send some input to that, and that is going, most of the APIs are request response based. There you are going to model the API. When you model the API, think about, like, you could use the analogy of the journey of the data through the system. The API is nothing but an exposed functionality of built-in application. That exposed functionality could mean that the what is input is you query for a weather of at a particular state, particular city at a given day. It goes and churns through the database and the logic that it built to kind of fetch you the temperature or humidity or any other weather details. These are mostly based on the request response. So you could model the request, you could model the response. You apply all the techniques of black box, and if you have fortunate enough to go look into the code how it is implemented, you could enrich the model by adding certain flows which will reflect the information that you know about how the thing is implemented. If you're doing a black box, you don't look at how the implementation is there. You just look at what it is supposed to do. Now, a true model will incorporate the elements of what the system is supposed to do from a requirements point of view, and it will also help you to exercise from a implementation point of view how it is doing it. What are the flows that you need to make sure that I am touching the implementation aspects of it, which may not be explicitly mentioned as a part of the requirement, right? So whether it's API or REST API, your approach is about modeling. First, modeling. Then in APIs, they're simpler because you don't have a UI to write the 10-15 steps of what to do. Most of the time, your test design for API would be generate this input file and run through this code, finish. And output, when the output comes, check whether this particular at particular XML node or JSON location, say whether that output value is there or not. So in which case there could be a generic model of API which you could use as a base class or a foundation. Then you can make adding the values to what kind of API you're testing, REST API, non-REST API, and so on. No new questions. I'm still trying to see if anything I left out. There was a question which is interesting on test cases and test scenarios. Okay, it always amuses me that how we can confuse ourselves in getting down with so many different conflicting terminologies and all that. I have heard people saying you generate test cases from test scenarios. I have heard people saying you generate test scenarios from test cases. Now, many times when I ask difference between test case and test scenario, each context you get a different definition. So the idea is, it is like a chicken or egg situation, whether this comes first or that comes first. So in any situation that you're a tester entering into a particular project, and you understand and ask the question, in that particular project, in that particular group, what they define scenarios, what they define test cases. So never get stuck in this maze of the terminologies, whether you should generate test cases to a scenario or test cases, or should be, okay, the question was, should we be writing only scenarios, not test cases? It is like asking, should we be writing only outline, not the detailed steps. If I may use the analogy of scenario means a very high level outline, test case means with the data and very specific variations of it. Now it is like asking, it is like saying that you are going to do what is called as minimalistic test representation or test case representation, and depending upon the context that you are in, just outline may be sufficient for you if your test case is meant to be used by your own team or some people, and depending upon whom you are writing your test case for, writing test scenario simply might serve your purpose. It may not you may not really go deeper. Or if the objective is different, people will insist you to go ahead and write test cases as well. Okay, there was this question on how to write effective test cases, how to write smart, effective smart test cases. I think I must bring to your notice, I think we have to check that. There was one long thread on a forum called Test Republic by Sharath Bairegoda. It still stands very fresh in my memory. Test Republic was a similar platform done by QAI, and there were a lot of question and answer. Sharath started this whole thing that should we do a test design or test cases. There was something related to test cases and design. It went for, I think I know, about 200 or 300, maybe 400 sub queries or the comments to that. It went into a longest I have seen one particular thread. And if I manage to get the link, I'll post on my blog. It's worth reading that thread, wherein every possible kind of a hesitation, query, comment, debate about the test cases was included in that thread. You should read that thread first. And coming back to what is an effective test case, go back to information objective. Who you are writing it for? What is their objective? How that particular test case will be used. Depending upon that, your effectiveness should be defined. Now, there is this thing called we were taught as a testing theory that effective test case is one which finds maximum number of bugs. Now, if you take this and scrutinize this claim or this definition, you would see that a test case will find a bug, not the tester. Anyway, as you know, test case will not find a bug. The tester who finds a bug, thanks to this whole this statement by Pradeep Sundarajan. Many of you know him. So, test case can't remain effective all along. It's not like a tablet for you. Every time you put it, it does the work for you. No, because however good it is, a one stagnant thing cannot be effective every time. So the whole question of how to write effective test cases is like asking how do I do effective modeling. How do I do effective modeling is limited by your creativity and your knowledge of the system and how deep you can go, how curious you are to represent it, and how good are you representing your thoughts. Basically, big part of the modeling is to represent thoughts about your application and your creativity. So effective test case is nothing but effective modeling. Effective test case cannot remain effective for forever. A test case finds bug once and it doesn't find second time because developer has fixed it. So that test case has the test case become ineffective then? No. The test case serves its purpose. Most of the time we need to keep the test suite and the minimalistic testing documentation live because it's always should align to the changing software or application or changing requirements or changing platform. So it's always you have to keep it fresh and aligned in line with what is changing. One test case I was expecting, which did not come, is the standard. I will ask the question and answer and share my views on that. Most of the my job as an automation manager, or automation lead, or automation architect, or lead of the COE and automation and all that has been this challenge with test cases are given to you, you need to automate. Right? Most of the time, what I found difficult with this is that the test cases either are too detailed, so much detailed that everything cannot be included in the automation, or they are too short that there is no enough detail in the test case for automation. Now, what happens is our standard model of automation, which is more like a beaten to death kind of a model, is This is how the people think and executive think about testing. Is first time when you have an application with you, first time you have written a test case, that test case has to be meant to be executed manually, means by human, and you record what the observation is, then the release goes live, and next time same test case should not be executed by the manual, means humans. Same in that case, that becomes a regression test case. That regression test case should be automated, which means you execute the manual test case only once. Subsequently, it should be automated. That is the very popular paradigm of automation. Mostly the GUI automation, right? This particular approach of automating the test cases subsequently, this thing has come to a point that you write test cases and throw it on the people, and they will automate. The person who is automating has no clue about with what intention the test case was written, and there are various different steps and different ways of writing test cases. Some people are good in English, some are people good in representing the language that they are talking. Some people are not so good. Some are grammatical mistakes. Some are so many variations of the test cases, and it becomes nightmare for an automation person to do automation. Now, I mean, many times during my work as an automation resource, contemplated on, again going back to minimalistic test design that makes a purpose. Now, when the person is writing a test case, if it is told that, oh, this is going to be automated, by the way, you better take care of the automation person requirement. Now, a poor fellow who is writing a test case, there is a manual person. He doesn't have any idea about what automation is, how the whole requirement is. He just writes what comes to him naturally as a human tester. Now, when that is moved to automation, it becomes difficult. Now, had that person who is writing the test case or test artifact is little educated on automation, and if he knows that this is going to be used by automation, probably he will write it in a way that is easy for automation person to understand. It doesn't go that way. Most of the time, our problems with automation and a lot of failures in automation is that the test cases are not written by applying the thought process, the one which I explained of proper modeling and representing and applying techniques, and making sure that the test is actually trying to do something. I can see people joining again. I hope you're not bored from my rant. Okay, I think we have 5 people, 7 now started again. Mahesh asked me to answer the question from Sandeep Garg. What tester need to be aware of in order to design the checks for automation, design test for exploration? I repeat Sandeep's question on what tester need to be aware of in order to design checks for automation, in order to design test for exploration. Now, checks for automation have to be documented, preferably in a format that can be consumed by the automation people. What are the best forms of something, best forms of the test case that can be consumed for automation? I would say the best one is some kind of a table which lists the values that you want to check. Each row of a table which explains what parameters, what inputs you are giving and what output is expected. If you can give that table, and this is just an example, I could think more. Table is one such model or a pattern which you can use to document or put your test cases for the checks for automation, For exploration, now as I have said, as you people already know, for exploration, the design or the test design happens concurrently with thinking, concurrently with execution, with both going hand in hand. You don't have a specific format for test design for exploration. Test design for exploration happens in the mind. You are actually collating your, I mean, lot of you should read a lot of Ajay's books on tips for exploratory testers, like what we can do different things and kind of create a toolbox. I always reminded of a lot of work done by likes of Alan Richardson and even James Lindsay in terms of exploratory testing. They create a lot of tool sets for you, a lot of cheat sheets by Elizabeth Hendrickson. These are the things that will help you to guide your mental process. In exploratory, you are trying to always look for what is my next idea, what is my next point, what is my next idea. Each idea is like a model in itself. The idea can be as big as model in itself. Now, as ideas are coming like a thoughts in your mind, like you're sitting for meditation and trying to focus on one thing, your mind runs away in 10 different things. Exploratory testing during that whole session, you are supposed to collect as many as ideas as possible, in which each idea is a design in itself. Each idea is a model in itself. So, if you ask me, how do you do test design for exploration? Just be more creative. Try to be always full with ideas that you want to explore in a given session. Create a lot of tool sets, a lot of tools for you to help in picking up what is my next idea. Where does my next idea coming from? What does my next idea wants me to do? What setup I need to create for my next idea? These are all things which are more broadened and divergent than the check automation test design, which is more or less pre-defined in a sense that it is defined earlier than you go for check automation, where it is meant for a programmer. You can cut off all the details which are not useful for a programmer. Just give the minimalistic thing that is required, and these two actually go in a different direction. I think no more new questions. I will wait for a few more minutes if something is still to be answered. Again, I appreciate people awake at 11 o'clock on Saturday night instead of being at some pub or some recreational place you people have invested in your profession and learning about. I really appreciate that passion. I think it's that passion which separates us from the crowd, and your enthusiasm, zeal to learn things is what makes you go forward in your career. Now, book for any book for modeling, I will have to think through this question. I think it's an excellent question. I really don't know any such books I can think of offhand. I'll probably think and post it on my blog. But again, see, it is like saying, is there any good book on creating a sketch? There are. I mean, as long as if you know what sketch you want to prepare, there are guidance to pick. How to sketch faces, how to sketch landscape, and all that. But the whole the domain or topic of modeling is so vast that you should actually kind of putting things together, like things like all the modelings, like your flow charts and like primitive models which are like patterns, fixed patterns. Your flow chart is a model, right? And any kind of a sketch is a model. Mind map is a model, like where everything emanates from a central topic is a model. Any kind of a sketch is a model. A table is a model, or a bar graph is a model. So now I probably need to think a little more deeper into this and give the examples of what are the. I mean, if I say test model, in fact, the word test model is also wrong only. We are not doing the test model. It's a model of the application or system that you are testing. A model is a representation of what you are testing. Model is a miniature version. Model is supposed to represent the reality in the best possible way. And model, and I'm reminded of this great quote from George E. Box. The quote says, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." You have to make many models to represent the. It's like saying you have a house of a 3D. A model is looking from a front of the house. What you see, a door and few windows and all, that is one model for you. If you are seeing the same house from the top, you see a square or a rectangle, you see the terrace, that's another model for you. You look it from the back, you look at what is there in the back gate or some garden or something. That is a model for you. Now, in order to gain the complete picture of a house, is it sufficient if I use only front model? Because it will only let me see what is in the front. Our software applications and the infrastructure in which the software is implemented are far more complicated than the example I give of a house. In order to create the entire house, a 3D picture of it, you need many views taken from it. Now, another term for model is a view. How do we view this application? Now, application is too big thing. How do I look at the screen? Screen is again complicated. How do I look at this particular form? How to look at the particular field? You can zoom into that. From there, you take a travel anywhere you want to go into the wilderness of where your one byte of data or some information that you keyed into the application makes it way into the all the way into the database somewhere there, and it gets written somewhere else and gets passed into some other downstream application. Now, modeling requires you to be creative like this. That's my experience so far. Mental model, informal model suggested by Annie Mary is one of the posts. Yes, good. I was searching for test public thread. Yeah, I will. Mahesh, you should look for Sharath Beregoda. I think Sharath is very much active on the blog. Ajay is connected to him very frequently. I have not had a communication with him, but again, through Ajay or Sharath, you will be able to get hold of that thread. And I think that's an amazing thread. This has lot of such debates incorporated with that. Now, when you're thinking now model, and in fact, I would say all models are mental in one way, because the idea of model first emanates in the mind or brain or whatever. You could get into another debate there. You think about that, and we think in pictures. Those pictures of a model come from a mental. Now, informal formal means if you are if you want to be very formal, you need to use like a flowchart. Then say a flowchart is a formal model. What is informal model? The sketch I draw, wherein I'll put one circle there in the middle, and I put one strip, which is like looking at your modeling a boundary, modeling a one domain, or I could use, for example, Venn diagram is a model. Venn diagram is a formal model. Now I can mix Venn diagram with a bar chart and some sketch I do on my own where I draw the arrows in and out. Informal model for me. It works for me. It helps me to represent my understanding of the application. What the modeling, I mean, I think this whole thing is now getting dragged into a, I mean, I'm getting more energized on that talking about models. Most of the time, the models are the best way to, oh God, oh, okay, good. Models are the best way to say, look, as a tester, you draw a model in whatever way you are convenient with, whatever way you are comfortable with. And you want to talk to your peer, say, okay, is this what you understand? So he will say, oh, you are missing this, or something like that. Both of you, when you are discussing, you are going to modify the model becomes richer. Then you go and take to a developer. The developer will say, oh, you missed completely implementation. Boss, this is going here. Now this particular value is going to here. Why don't you show your service call here? Why don't you show that there is a validation happening in the JavaScript? No, you need to model that validation here. You put the validation rule here. Right? So rule will become if else loop. The moment you get if else loop, you get a decision tree model here. Like that, your model is your way of telling the world, your peers, dev, test, and implementation, anybody in the team, say, here is how I understand this. Show me what am I missing. In that way, you can improve the understanding of the application, and that model will become your golden source. Whenever you want to write a test case, you just draw a line through that. Start here and end here is a path. Now, if you keep your test documentation as a model plus the paths through the model, they are most lean and most current. Then you can't really become obsolete in that, because your way of representing is so flexible that you can move around things. That's what is the my idea of model. Anything else? Okay. Now, when you, Prathamesh, share the links of that blogs on the TDD page. Which blogs you're referring to? Yeah. So I'm going to do a blog post, maybe one or two blog posts on what I spoke today, and some of the links that some of the references that I talked about. One is this, Sharad Bairegaura's thread on Test Republic. I don't know whether it is closed or not. We'll have to check that out. And there are cheat sheets. There are Elizabeth Hendrickson's site. There are cheat sheets. There are black box models. I mean, I would recommend who interested in the exploratory testing visit James. I can see 3 people logging in. Any more questions that you would like to ask or share? Any feedback, comments? I think we should wind up now because your internet is bored of me. Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. I think you found this session useful. I think I would have been. I think this is the first time I'm speaking for such a long time without any preparation. I thought uh, probably next few sessions, EMA sessions, I would be more prepared. That's something which I learned from this session as well. That I can articulate better if I have some examples. Sure. I, I think this kind of an interaction is very useful, though it is a little difficult because I don't see the audience. It is again a very difficult proposition for a speaker. You don't know how people are reacting. Are they bored? Should I change the topic? Should am I going on and something? Um, so yeah, I'll definitely come up with another topic that I can bore people with. Okay, there is a question: how can we make test modeling more mainstream, easily understandable, even more to a 6-month experienced tester using terminologies? Examples: model created in simple ways, shared with more and more testers. I think there's a good suggestion. Uh, I have been thinking about, but I couldn't take. Remember at some point of there used to be a tool called Smart Testing. There's a company called Smart Testing Designers, and these people used to do what is called as model-based testing. I did talk about model-based testing, and probably go and look up on model-based testing. Harry Robinson is an authority in that, and from Microsoft. And I have a privilege of working with him side by side, create a model at Microsoft, and it was a very good humbling experience for me. So follow up in Harry's website, Harry Robinson, Microsoft. He used to be an ex-Microsoft guy, and I don't know where he works now, but again, he's one of the pioneers in that. But those people coined the term called model-based testing, but I would say it is model-based test design. But I wouldn't even use something like model-based test design, because all test design has models implicit. What people are referring to at that time was a state machine model. So I think the yeah. So in order to make testing interesting to the people, they should start thinking in terms of first representing their understanding about the requirement or the feature that they are testing. If there is a document that they can read and say, okay, they are represent the requirement. Now, most of the time, the testers are not asked to represent the requirement. What people are asked is, here's the requirement, write test cases. That's the direction given. Most of the time, people who are actually working on the floor as a tester are not being told that in order to write test cases, you should need to represent your understanding in some form. Now, testers think that requirement document written by somebody is that representation. It is an initial way, but ultimately you need to develop that is written with for some purpose. Maybe most of the requirements are written by the BAs to say, okay, this is how the function should work, this is the logic should be. Those requirements are written for developers to implement. Now, if at all you need to use it for testing, you obviously need to use it in a way that you need to express your understanding. Again, coming back to the analogy I gave, is a huge one 3D house, and you are looking from different angles, which is a model. Now the BRD or SRS or whatever you call it as requirements document is a view of the house from the front door. But as a tester, you should at least create 3 or 4 models of the house looking from different angles. How will you get that viewpoint? Testers are not asked to generate the viewpoint. And again, the question that came up again and again is that in the Agile and the DevOps small cycle model, how will we do the test design? But they're thinking this test design is about writing tons and tons of, loads and loads of pages of documentation or pages of test cases. That's not test design all about. That design, much of it is thinking, much of it is modeling. If you don't do that, you'll obviously find it boring because it's writing the same stuff again and again. It is writing some kind of a procedure for you. For some people, that is the objective, and you write it. But most of the time, in order to make it interesting, you need to represent your understanding in the model, and from there, you can generate whatever you want. You generate a table, you generate a written procedure. But if you leave that piece out, the whole challenge of representing your understanding of the application, the feature, the infrastructure, the flows, the data, the logic, everything is insanely complicated and challenging exercise for everybody. It's very creative, and sky is the limit. Android days. Hi, if you seem to be logging again, coming back again. You have any questions? Anything which I did not answer? Geosly Andrides. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. If there are no questions, can I hang up? Love to talk, love to go on, but I'm sure I don't want to bore people with their Saturday night. Anything else that you guys like to know and throw a question at me? Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mahesh, for arranging this. Okay, and probably you need to do a lot of editing. I'm sure initially I was, I mean, at least video was bad. We all struggled a bit. Would love to see the connected video. Again, thanks everyone for taking your time on Saturday to chat with me, and I hope it was useful. And feel free to be in touch with me on my blog. You can share comments on this page. Let's keep the talk going on. Thank you very much. A very good night and good morning on the basis of where you are. Have a nice weekend. Thank you very much.